Hello, welcome to the Arizona Water 2021 virtual conference. I want to thank everybody for attending. Also, a big thanks to our conference sponsors who will be shown at the end of the presentation. My name is Tawanda Heap, and I will be moderating this presentation. In this video presentation, Scott Christensen will present utilizing standards and compliance to strengthen operational cybersecurity in water and wastewater. Formerly GE Digital's subject matter expert for operational cybersecurity, Scott brings 20 years of experience in the cybersecurity market with over a decade of focus on securing industrial control systems. Scott has worked with companies such as Bell Aviation, PPG, Penn State University, Schlumberger, and Shell. He is a leader in securing critical infrastructure and has led efforts for compliance in NERC, NIST, and EIC 62443. With that, I'll turn this session over to Scott.
Thank you so much, Tawanda. I appreciate it. So today, guys, we're going to cover talking about compliance. And first, I'll start off with, who is GrayMatter? Who's the company I work with? I think it's kind of important to set the fact of where we're coming from. So GrayMatter was founded over 30 years ago, 1991. And we really focus on three key verticals, obviously water and wastewater, manufacturing, and oil and gas. And what's important about that is we only focus on the operational technology or the OT space. So when we come from the expertise of seeing what your peers are doing and what's worked and what's not worked in other organizations similar to yours. So when we start talking about cybersecurity, and I kind of put up a lot of the things we do at GrayMatter, but I think it's important to look at cybersecurity horizontally within your organization. So as you go through plant modernization efforts, as you go through things like analytics and predictive maintenance, and you start to look for kind of the modernization or industry 4.0, look at cybersecurity as horizontal to all those things. I think cybersecurity is most successful when we look at it as an enabler rather than a disabler of things I want to do. So when you start thinking about it, how do I use security to do more of what I want to do day to day? And it's not necessarily that we want you to become cybersecurity only. It's more about using that to enable and expand what your capabilities are. So when we start talking about threats to water, threats to industrial environments, every year they do a survey, SANS Institute does, and it kind of covers what are the threat vectors you should be most worried about. And if you look at the first one, I think that really screams OT to me. Devices and things that can't protect themselves. So think of all our fun little three-letter acronym devices, PLCs and VFDs and HMIs, all these devices that I can't load on things like antivirus. I can't load on intrusion detection. It becomes much more challenging to protect these devices. And so what you'll see is that we'll use the term compensating controls pretty often. So that's really what you want to think about is if the device can't protect itself, what am I using to protect and enable that device? And then the next two we look at, internal threats and external threats, are on every security watch list, whether it be the vendor coming in with an infected USB stick, or whether it be someone trying to hack into my network, as we saw in the Florida attack recently, trying to break in and do, cause malicious or damage my environment. And then the fourth one I always find very interesting, because when we look at OT cybersecurity, we weren't really focusing on ransomware 5-6 years ago. It was really a focus of healthcare and financial institutes, and they were consistently being attacked. So they remediated and kind of closed a lot of the holes that were allowing ransomware to really propagate across. And so what we saw with the malicious attackers and the organizations, organized crime that uses ransomware to fund it, we saw them look to pivot, and they were looking for a couple things. They were looking big flat networks. Do we have that in water and OT? Obviously we do. And then they were looking for people who have large amounts of data that they have to protect, because the larger the amount of data, the more I can charge in ransomware. So what we saw was it went from 1 or 2 years ago where we saw less than 5 attacks on municipal water to last year where we hit the triple digits in attacks on municipal water. So what we're seeing is it's becoming a much more common. I think we're only going to see it be more prolific as we see that the attacks become profitable to the organized crime agencies. So one of the things that we saw happen about a few years ago is the AWA passed specifically creating cyber infrastructure rules around what you need to do to protect your infrastructure. And I'll show some of the deadlines regarding who needs to be certified and who needs to have an action plan later. But first, you got to talk about what are we trying to do. The first, we want to look at what's the risk to the system for malviolent acts. So when we look at risk, we want to find a way that we can measure objectively what the risk is, so I know where I stand and where I can prioritize the different areas of security and different control areas I want to protect. And what is my resiliency? In the case of an incident, what is my ability to bounce back quickly to something happening? And then we start putting in place things more continuous, like looking at monitoring and understanding our financial infrastructure. But then we also want to look at, storage and use and what chemicals are available and what's the day-to-day operation and maintenance of the system. So what we're really trying to look to do is, what are the potential impacts to my infrastructure, and have I mitigated? Do I have an action plan for the most common threat vectors that might impact my day-to-day operations? And for those who aren't aware, these are the kind of the deadlines we're looking at. So the larger utilities started certifying late last year. They're starting to move forward to putting in their action plans. And once you've submitted that kind of assessment, then the next step is, what is, 6 months post, what is your plan? What is your action plan to remediating those issues? So what's great about the way they are approaching this is, first you have the identification phase. Here are all my risks. Here are where I think I have the biggest issues. And then secondary, what is my action plan to address those issues? So I can actually start to use this to leverage and build maturity in my cyber program. So rather than treating compliance as a checkbox and saying, I've done this, I've submitted the bare minimum, I encourage you to look at using compliance to say, here are the problems I should be addressing, and let's establish a good working plan for how do we build that in. And as we look for over a 5-year cycle, how are we measuring the risk against the maturity of previous assessments? So as you do it, you develop this plan and this actionable item to be a little bit better than you were before. And when I want you to think about cybersecurity, I really want you to have a mindset of, it's not a destination. I can't ever plant my flag and say, boom, I'm done, I'm secure. It's more of a journey, and you're trying to eliminate the threats as they develop, but also prioritizing which ones are real threats and which are perceived threats. And do I have a way to measure that risk? So when I say measuring risk, that leads me straight into the NIST cybersecurity framework. For those who aren't aware, the NIST is National Institutes of Standards and Technology. It's a federally sponsored group from DHS and FBI that created a risk-based assessment methodology with 5 key control areas and a bunch of sub-control areas. So when I look at the 5 key areas, identify, do I know my critical assets? Do I know my critical operations? Do I even know what versions of assets I have? So if I have a specific brand PLC, do I know what version it is? And then can I detect the threats as they occur? So do I know when there's an intrusion? Do I know when something changed in my environment? And do I have protections in place? So if you think about my communications, do I encrypt my traffic? Do I close ports on my firewall? Do I have just good basic hardening around? And then if an incident happens, do I really understand what my response plan is? Is it well communicated to the rest of the team? So a lot of times we see that the right technologies are in place and the right plan is in place, but when an incident happens, people don't know what to do. They don't know who to call. They don't know where the escalation procedure is. So developing that response plan is critical. And then in the case I have to rebuild or I have to restore, do I have a recovery plan? Do I have good data backups? Do I have version control? Do I have the ability to measure what worked and what didn't? So really having that recovery plan, that disaster recovery plan, is critical when you look at the different areas of risk. So as we talk through the NIST subcategories, these are the areas that we're going to try to measure, right? So access control, who accesses what, how do they access it, and do I have account management? Do I separate my roles out for permissions? Do I have the ability to audit against that? Do I have encryption? So do I protect my configurations and my communications? Do I have a business continuity plan? If I have a firewall in place, do I have the right rules? It's amazing how often someone will put a firewall in place and over time they create different access rules and not realize that those rules can conflict with each other. So for example, if I say don't allow X behavior, but then my very next rule says allow all, how does that conflict affect my firewall rules? Am I opening myself up for risk? Do I have good policies in place? A lot of times what we've seen with customers is they'll copy and paste what worked for policy in IT, and they'll try to put it into OT. And the problem there is a lot of times there's not a realization of a priority shift. So when we look at a lot of the IT priorities, it traditionally starts off as a CIA priority. So confidentiality is number one. I want to protect email. I want to protect credit card information. I want to protect healthcare information. And then integrity, then availability. It's nothing to take a webmail server down to do maintenance. You probably have seen this when your IT department will send out an alert says the X server will be down for the next 4 hours for maintenance, or we're taking it down over the weekend. I can't always do that in OT. I can't say no one's going to have water for 48 hours. So I have to be able to put a plan in place that allows me to modify what works well in IT into my industrial environment. And then I want to make sure that I have good training and protections in place. So awareness, do my people know the threats? Do we know why we're remote accessing? And when we think about remote access, I want you to think about the sake that it's not just who's accessing and what they're accessing, but how are they accessing it? And I'll cover a little bit about that, the attack in Florida and why that was a failure on a couple of different areas. So when you look at the philosophy that we want you to approach, we want to look at, and this is not our proprietary. This is pretty much a standard. You want to look at the people, process, and technology. When you look at my people, do they follow best practices? Do they know why we have rules in place? Why we don't allow them to do certain things? Do they understand what the threats are? And then the process, right? Do I have the right policies? Am I using them the right way? Are they well communicated? And a lot of times with customers, we want to talk about security versus practicality, right? I can be ultra secure and locked down and nothing works and it's a difficult to get day to day. Or I can be ultra practical and everything's open and I'm constantly dealing with the threats, the fact that anybody can get in my network. So finding where that balance is kind of critical. And then the technology, it's not always about buying the newest widget. It's a lot of times are we using our dollars right? Are we investing in the right tools? Are our tools configured well? Are they integrated well? So if I have firewall and I have different tools like that, are they going back to some type of log aggregation or SIM tool that allows me to collect the data and understand what's going on? And then also measuring what worked and what didn't, because we can learn a lot by other failures and what didn't work, and we try to not repeat those, right? So understanding what failed and how do we improve upon the process. So that's that maturity we want to build over this program and over time. So I talked a little bit about the Florida attack, and I'm sure that everybody's a little interested in what happened. So I kind of broke down pretty simply what happened. So sometime prior to 2020, someone installed TeamViewer, which is an open source remote access application. It literally allows me to control a remote desktop somewhere else. It's definitely designed more about the convenience of remote rather than the security around remote. Sometime in July of last year, they decided they no longer needed the remote access, but no one uninstalled the application and no one revoked credentials. So it was still sitting on the SCADA system, and they were still capable, even though it wasn't in use. And then what happened about 3 weeks ago is while performing a daily task, the operator noticed the cursor flash across the screen, noticed that mouse control had been taken away. And he noticed this had happened for a few minutes, and then he noticed there was an attempt to change the lie levels from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million. So as he noticed this happening, he jumped in, disconnects from TeamViewer, and stops it from happening. But you get your mind wondering what would have happened if he hadn't been looking at that screen. So when we start thinking about remote access, I want you to really think about, how are we going to do this access? Are we doing it in a way that doesn't introduce new risk? And B, do we need to, are we required access? Are we going to get a benefit of having remote access? So you start looking through, who's accessing, what are they accessing, and really measuring, do we want to accept the risk associated with such access? And so we look at the best practices, and this is what I really want you to start thinking through, is what are the best practices that I can build into my program by using compliance and using standards? One is understand, do you have a baseline of normality? What does good look like in your network? Because it's really important when we start looking about understanding our networks, we can really take advantage of the fact that operational networks by their nature are designed to be static. If it's working, don't change it, don't break it, right? So the fact that I can look at normal, I can create a snapshot of what good behavior is, means I can then alert against abnormal. Anything that might change in my network, whether it be a new IP address or rogue device showing up on my network, or if it's a change in behavior. If I have a device that traditionally is read-only access, and all of a sudden that device switches to write access, not necessarily malicious, but that's a big change in behavior. And I encourage you to look at technologies that actually can even go farther down and can look at function code level and look at the variables within function codes of my industrial protocols. So if I start to see variables change outside of normal parameters, I can be alerted to that because I know what normal is. Anything outside normal, I can be alerted to. And we start looking at compliance. We want to be able to leverage compliance and assessments to improve security. So one of the things that when we start talking about assessments and really looking at the way we measure risk, it's how often I've seen assessments done and then it gets put in the round file or it gets put on a shelf and never really acted upon. So if you do the assessment, really evaluating, did we start closing some of those risks that were identified? Did we improve our health and hygiene of our network? Did we start doing it? And if we didn't, why didn't we do it? What didn't work? Why were we not able to change our network configurations so that you don't repeat the same mistakes? So you really want to treat assessments as not something that I do just for the sake of doing an assessment, but taking that data and actually using it to improve your infrastructure. And as I said earlier, one of the things I want you to really consider is that I don't want you to think that there's ever a point where you can stop looking at security because the threats are always evolving. And so you need to evolve your security. And when I think about this, I want you to think about also not thinking about a single point of failure. We're really good on operations on doing redundancy in our day-to-day operations, but we're really bad when we look at redundancy from a security perspective. So I want you to think about the concept of defense in depth. So defense in depth is a military concept that simply means I don't want to rely on any single one method for protecting all my infrastructure. I want to have layers. So that way you become a little bit more difficult and each layer improves upon and covers a gap that a previous layer did not protect against. And with that, I thank you and I encourage you to reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions you might have and we're happy to work with you on anything you might need.
Thank you, Scott. That was an excellent presentation. I do have a question that I would like to pose to you. How do you advise water services to get started when it comes to assessing their cybersecurity needs?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple ways. You can engage a professional, someone to come in and help you, give you an objective third eye. You can engage internally. You can use, there's tons of resources through NIST and through EPA and through some of the AWWA organizations that they very much have a lot of those kind of self-assessment criteria there. But the real first start is if you follow the NIST guideline, the first thing is, can I identify my assets on my network? And when I think about identification, I think about that Excel sheet that we all kind of keep. It has my PLCs, it kind of has the manufacturers, and it kind of has the version. We all know that Excel sheet, right? And we all accept that that sheet is very rarely up to date. So just starting there is getting an update inventory of what you have in your network and what versions you have is really the first step. Just understanding what are my critical assets. Great question.
Thank you. And I believe Jeremy has a question for you.
Okay.
Yeah, hi Scott. Jeremy Boren here with GrayMatter. Thanks for today's presentation. Just a question, what are some of the misconceptions that you find are really common when you're talking with water, wastewater utilities, and they're looking to assess their approach to operational technology cybersecurity?
There's a couple big ones, right? So the first one is, oh, I have IT, they put up a firewall. I've probably heard this the most common. And what we've usually seen happen is, yes, IT has it. And yes, even if you have a firewall and it has good policies, a lot of the times that's where they stop. So if you look at the firewall at the perimeter, everything below is open. And IT really doesn't want to touch operations. And operation doesn't really want IT down there most often. But the thing is, what you're saying is, if I can defeat that one firewall, that means it's all open greenfield for me below it. So that's usually the first thing. The second I hear, and it's probably, overwhelmingly 80% of, we hear this over and over again, is I have an air gap or I have a disconnected network. And what we're finding is that's very rarely true. One, are you connected to the business network? If you are in any way, shape, or form, you don't really have a true air gap because I can traverse the business network to get to you. If you have any remote sites that use any kind of public transport like cellular, you don't have an air gap anymore. And then lastly, even if you have a true air gap, if you look at a lot of the attacks that have happened, going all the way back 11 years ago to Stuxnet, most of those attacks were on air gap networks. We always talk about the easiest way to beat an air gap is with SneakerNet, having someone walk in and USB stick. And what happens is because you think you have an air gap, you actually don't have visibility outside of your networks. You don't know what's going on if you're not looking at your network directly. So you lose that efficiency and that visibility a lot of times. And so when you have that air gap, I can use it as an attacker to take advantage of that disconnected network, because if I get down below, I can live down there for a long time, and you're not even aware I'm there because I'm not transacting over your gap. I'm just trying to do what I can to learn and gather information, do reconnaissance. And by the time I decide to do something malicious, I've got full command and control functionality over everything, and it's really hard to get me out at that point. And then probably the last one I think is one we hear over and over again is that I don't have any remote connectivity. I don't have a need for remote connectivity. And that may be the case, and it's something we hear pretty commonly. But we also see things like what happened in Oldsmart, where if you don't allow remote connectivity, does not necessarily mean someone in your infrastructure is not trying to remotely connect in. So making sure you audit that remote connectivity, and where it's applicable, you have a plan for introducing remote connectivity in a secure way. Good questions.
So thank you for addressing those.
Mhm.
You mentioned the Florida incident again. What was one of your biggest takeaways with that situation?
It's a couple of things that were really big, and I think we'll learn more as we go. But I think the first thing is, if you decommission, and this is, we talk about rogue accounts and orphaned accounts a lot, but if you use an application or you use some type of remote connectivity, making sure that it's completely revoked from your system is important. So that account management, that access management is super important. And then one of the things we don't know yet either is, what are the other fail safes that might be in play, like set points on the PLCs that wouldn't allow this to actually happen. We don't know these kind of things. So making sure that you have those additional layers, right? Because what we saw is multiple failures would be the nice way to put it, across the board. And if you just put a couple things in place, right? So if you're going to allow remote connectivity, have it done securely. If you're gonna allow access to be changed and command and control functionality, make sure there are limits. And then, making sure you protect your credentials are all kind of key components. And then I think lastly, something that's not been actually publicized yet, I think we'll find out that some of this may have been an internal problem, that there may have been either a vendor or disgruntled employee or someone who didn't protect their credentials. That was where the exposure really started. So when we start thinking about that, making sure your people have an awareness program of the risks associated with it.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. It looks like we've run out of time. I wanted to take a minute and thank all of our sponsors that are shown on the screen. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. This concludes our presentation, and we'll see you on the next video. To claim your PDH hours for this session, your PDH code is 064SC.